Hey, welcome to the Magnificast. I'm Dean.
And I'm Matt.
And this week we're talking to Drew Van Land, a PhD candidate at the University of Kentucky and a Christian guy who recently went to the big deal Chicago Socialism 2017 #conference, #last week, it's good to have you, Drew. But before that, we have some podcast news. If you haven't listened to the last 2 weeks because you knew I was going to be gone, you should, because they were good podcasts. Thanks, John, and also Zach for filling in. It was really fun to listen to those podcasts on the airplane on the way back and be on the other side of this podcast. I sound a lot smarter when I'm not present. Like when people say that I would have something interesting to say about something, it turns out I feel way smarter than I actually am.
Yeah,
so.
Most of Zach and I's conversation was like, man, I bet Dean would know the answer to this question.
Spoiler alert, I don't know anything about Catholicism or Leonardo Boff. Yeah, leave that to the professionals. That's why I'm part of this, part of this church. I don't have to do that.
Sacramental theology is so weird. I don't get it.
Yeah, I will say, the only reason I go to church is the Eucharist, and I find all other aspects of it boring and grating. So, I don't know, that's my one difference, I guess, with Zach in particular. Is, I just, don't like going, and I don't want to like going either.
Yeah, church isn't always fun.
Yeah, all right, more to say about that later in the future. Why we don't like going to church, episode 17.
Oh my gosh.
All right, what else do we have going on since I've been gone, Matt? Anything exciting?
Yeah, I've been saving this for when you came back. We have a new iTunes review, which is very good. Okay, so before Zach and I recorded that podcast, he was telling me that his favorite part of the Magnificast is when we ridicule and mock the people who leave us reviews. And yeah, that's also my favorite part of the podcast. Okay, I didn't really think of it as mocking. If any reviewers feel mocked, I apologize.
Yeah, or ridiculed. We are the ridiculous ones, not you.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like, okay, so we have a new one, and the new one is very good. And the joke is that there's not much to mock in it, really. So this is from Alex at Subject to Truth on Twitter, who I know and follow, and who is a good person to follow. Subject to Truth, follow that guy. Anyways, it sounds like he was listening to all of the other commentary we gave on the other reviews, and he just made the perfect review.
The grading rubric has been set.
Yeah, that's right. A+ on this one. Okay, so here's the review. I'll read it anyways because I like talking about myself and how good we are. So the title of the review is very good. It's called "Make Christian Socialism Great Again."
I'm gonna get that hat.
Yeah, of course. That's oh man, we should make those and then I don't know, give them to
red
people.
It's perfect. There's tons of red blank hats laying around, I'm sure, left over from that campaign, so we could just get those on the cheap.
Yeah, sounds good. Sounds good to me. Okay, so Alex says, after a somewhat rocky start, this podcast is quickly growing into something very solid and interesting. It's one of only a couple of podcasts that tries to seriously explore the boundaries between Christianity and left politics, which the hosts do a remarkable job at, and is a necessary lifeline for faithful comrades otherwise lost in a sea of trap houses and other nonsense. Increases in production quality have really helped listenability, which I'm sure will only continue to improve over time. I hope that's
especially
true.
If you donate to our Patreon.
Yeah, for sure.
Right.
The more money we put into our computer, the better it sounds. Okay, minor quibble, Alex says. Most recent episode 13 aside, topic selection has been a little bit all over the place. That is 100% true. I mean, holy crap! We talked about summer camp one week. That is the most all over the place. It was a fun conversation for me and John, but definitely does not make sense in the overarching scheme of the podcast. Anyways, Alex says would like to see a mix of classic texts and/or foundational discussions to balance out some of the more contemporary interventions. Overall, recommend highly. This is good feedback. I think that we should do these things. We should talk more about the historical texts of whatever.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's make a commitment to doing that. Not next week, but
no, probably not
soon.
the week after either. But
yeah,
soon.
yeah. But we'll think about it.
Yeah, I will consider it for sure. I have like a very good, if I do say so myself, a very good knowledge of Marx specifically, and I would love to talk more about Marx.
Yeah, can confirm that you have a very good knowledge of Marx.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm always like vaguely gesturing towards some kind of Marxist principle I like heard in a dream at one time in my life. You know, some Freudian unconscious thing bubbling up, and Matt's like, "Oh yeah, well that's 18th Premiere, like this page. Obviously, that's it." So
my favorite thing to do is to chime into conversations I do not belong in, and then say, "Well, in the German ideology, Marx says that communism is actually the movement against, the overarching history of capitalism," and then liberals are like, "I don't know, man, that's not right." I like it a lot. I like knowing things about Marx, and we should do that, and other historical things too. I liked one of my favorite episodes that we've done is the Herbert McCabe one with Derek. That was really fun.
Yeah, that was fun. Let's do that. Okay, great. Thank you, Alex. Super good review, A+. Please send us your feedback. Also, that would be really helpful. I don't know. It's good to know what people actually find useful instead of us just talking into the void. I mean, we'll do it. We do it. But it would be nice to do less of it. Speaking of talking to the void, Virilio Reading Group is a thing that's happening right now, as we speak, as you listen, that is.
Yeah, by the time you hear this, you'll have missed the first reading group, probably. But there's still time. There's still time to get in on this. So give us $1 on Patreon, and we'll start including you in the emails, and you can be a part of it.
Yeah, if you don't know what it is, there's more information on the blog. But basically, Matt and I just isolated some places where Paul Virilio, this Christian anarchist writer and thinker, and a bunch of other things, we isolated some places where he talks about his relationship to both Christianity and the left. And he's a really wild dude, kind of a weird guy, but very cool and useful, I think. And at the very end, we're going to chat with this guy, Jason Adams, who is part of the New Center for Research and Practice. Is that right? Or is it Practice and Research?
No,
I forget.
Research and Practice.
Okay, New Center for Research and Practice. Anyway, he's actually teaching a class there on Paul Virilio right now. And he's written on Virilio in the past and interviewed him one time. So he knows what he's talking about. And he'll come in at the very end and kind of clear up all our questions or whatever. So cool opportunity for $1.
It's just the best deal.
Cool. Well, it's good to be back with you, Matt. Thanks for holding down the fort. I had a great time while I was gone, but we did miss you. You're the only person we sent a photo to, Emily and I, while we were gone. So you should feel good about that.
I feel so good about it. Yeah, man, I'm psyched you're back, and I don't have to do this anymore by myself, and it'll just be better now.
The brocialism continues.
The brocialism. Bernie Bros over here.
No, that's not true.
I know.
Bernie Step Bros. That's what I would say.
Yeah,
maybe we have the same dad maybe somewhere, but our moms are definitely different.
Yeah, our moms are communism.
Momunism.
Momunism. Yeah, that's good. That's a good ideology right there.
Yeah, good.
All right, well,
let's
cool. Get into it.
Without further ado, let's just go straight to Drew. Let's cut this nonsense.
All right.
So yeah, Drew, maybe we could just start with you. What have you been up to this last couple weeks?
The last few weeks, I was finishing up an online class I was teaching for my alma mater, Trinity Christian College, and I finally have all my logic class lectures recorded and online, so that's cool because I'm teaching it again in the fall, and now if I have a sick day, I can just have somebody put it on for my students. So, and it feels like it's kind of solidified now. I've taught it for the last year, and just to have a course that I feel pretty good about, I feel good. The next couple of weeks, I'm doing actually all summer long I've been doing this reading list for my metaphysics and epistemology comps. I'm in a philosophy PhD program, by the way, but I'm taking a big test in August. I'm studying for that, and I'm teaching a class on philosophy and science fiction in the fall. So I'm going to start.
Whoa.
Oh, that sounds awesome.
Yeah, I'm really
Yeah.
excited. It's my first upper level class that I'll be teaching. So I'm putting together the curriculum for that.
That sounds super fun.
So what are you reading for a class on science fiction and philosophy?
Yeah, so I like to teach historically and kind of bring out the thematic distinctions along the way rather than teaching in kind of a topical manner. So I'm trying to do two things at once in that. So we're going to be covering kind of the history of the last century of science fiction, kind of the high points, starting with kind of probably talking a bit about like H.G. Wells and stuff, but probably not reading any, and then getting into kind of the classics, Asimov, and then moving into the kind of counterculture era and the growing kind of technological developments at sci-fi, kind of the more cynical approach, and then moving into some more kind of, I guess what you call intersectional writings by like authors of color and women, and where those issues of intersectionality kind of arise. So we'll be reading some Octavia Butler, and that's the historical sweep of sci-fi. And then I'm going to be pairing with each of the readings kind of a historical sweep of philosophers. So we're going to read, I'm not sure if we're going to read the entirety of 1984 by George Orwell, but we'll at least read part of it. And so I'm going to pair it with Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. We'll be talking a bit about language games and things like that. So that's kind of my plan for that course.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would take that class.
Yeah, it sounds rad. One time I got to teach this really cool honors seminar that was, we read, I don't know, a handful of Lovecraft stories, and
Nice.
then read Eugene Thacker's the Horror of Philosophy trilogy books. It was kind of something similar, but it wasn't as historical. But it was cool. So same idea. Science
Awesome.
fiction as philosophy and philosophy as science fiction kind of stuff.
Yeah, I was trying to find a way to fit some Lovecraft in, but I don't think we'll have time. But,
Yeah, it's a whole wild ride that you have to do.
Matt, what have you been up to?
I've been planning this summer class I'm teaching. I got the opportunity to like redesign a ton of my department's curriculum, and the biggest amount of work has been like redoing the intro level media studies comm class, and I get to teach it online this week and for the rest of the summer. So that's been occupying a ton of my time. So just been doing that basically. Lots of like online class designing.
Nice.
Yeah.
That sounds
Dean,
fun.
how was your vacation?
Oh man, I was telling Matt last night, we were just chatting that like it was so good that I feel bad talking about it, which is a good problem to have. Yeah, it was cool. I spent 2 weeks on Maui in Hawaii with some family. My brother lives there with his wife and kids, and yeah, it was totally absurd, just like ridiculously good. All the things were good. It's like the first vacation I've ever done on my own where like nothing monumentally wrong happened. Like I didn't end up staying with like the wrong person on an accident or like paying too much money for something or whatever. So yeah, it was crazy good. I don't know, learned a ton of stuff about like Hawaii, and I don't know, there's a lot of interesting colonial political history that is still very alive there, and some of my family's really involved in that kind of thing. So yeah, it was fun. Now I'm coming back to my real life and trying to figure out all the loose ends that I didn't tie up before I left and figuring all that out. So my brain is like basically just complete like scrambled eggs right now. So we'll find out after we're done recording this podcast. I'll figure out what I'm supposed to be doing.
Dang, man.
But totally worth it.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't feel too sorry for you.
Yeah, you shouldn't. No one should feel sorry for me for a very long time.
Yeah.
There's a lot of like credit that the world has given me for a while that I'll be paying back. So.
Yeah, good. You should.
So Drew, one of the things you did recently, which is why we're going to talk to you on this podcast, is you went to the Socialism 2017 conference in Chicago.
Yeah.
We're going to ask you a bunch of questions about that. But maybe you could start off just telling us a little bit about what it was. Like, what does it do? Who does it? Who was there? Just the general. For people who've never even heard of this, which was me before, like, January or something. What the heck is going on?
Yeah, likewise. This came on my radar earlier this year, and at first I thought, oh, awesome, that's so close. And my second thought was, oh, that's, like, not good for me for a number of reasons, mostly because I have, like, 2 3-year-olds. And then I saw that they have free childcare, and so I pitched it to my wife that, like, hey, do you want some time to go hang out with your friends, and we can, like, stick the kids in a nursery? And that worked out really well for both of us. So
yeah,
that was the big draw.
That's an easy
and
sell.
Then, yeah, but what it is it's not the only kind of congregation of socialists in America, thankfully, but it is one of the most visible, I think, just because the left has been in retreat for so long. But I think in the last couple of years, especially since the Bernie campaign, but, as some movements have picked up steam that we'll talk about in this episode, socialism is kind of back on the horizon, back on the agenda. And so even though this is a conference that happens every year, at least for the last, I don't think it's been going that long, maybe since 2013 or so. But this isn't the first one, even though I hadn't heard of it before. But it's put on by the ISO, the International Socialist Organization, which is kind of a Trotskyist American organization of socialists founded in the late 70s. And it was co-sponsored by the International Socialist Review, Haymarket Books, Jacobin Magazine, and the Socialist Worker newspaper. And it was just a wide-ranging series of talks which were broadly connected through the slogan, build the left, fight the right.
It's a pretty good slogan.
That's cool, man. Well, yeah, I didn't really know about it until very recently as well, but it looks like, yeah, it has been going on for a while. So, besides, like, the free childcare, which is very nice, actually, all conferences should do that. That's such a good idea. Like, why did you want to go? Were there any, like, strong ideological reasons, or just going for the fun of it? I don't know. Why'd you show up?
Well, I think like a lot of people, have been really radicalized since the Trump election. I mean, I think philosophically, I've been there for a few years, or been moving in that direction. I mean, I've been drifting leftward since college, starting, freshman year as a very conservative, traditional, Protestant, and then moving into libertarianism, and then kind of your centrist liberalism. And I think now I'm pretty far left wing on most issues. There's a few holdouts that I think make sense within my faith and worldview, but I guess I consider myself a fellow traveler with most of these radical currents most of the time. And so just after the election, I joined a local group of socialists here in Kentucky called the Kentucky Workers League. And just because of school and family commitments, I'm not able to be that invested. Like today, they're actually, they have a planning session for kind of the upcoming year and stuff. So I try to keep abreast of what's going on locally. And there have been, a number of protests kind of in conjunction with national protests and stuff. But then there's also ongoing movements and kind of a desire to build dual power institutions at a local basis in solidarity with other national trends and international trends, really. So anyway, that's kind of where I am. I think by nature, I'm a pretty theoretical person. I'm a pretty nuanced person and more interested in ideas than actions. And I think the older I get, the more I realize how privileged and kind of stupid that is in a lot of ways. And so kind of forcing myself to get out of my comfort zone a little bit more. And I'm studying social and political philosophy. So, but I have very little background, no background really in activism of any kind. So I'm trying to change that.
That's cool. So this conference was kind of a window into what those people are up to, what movements on the ground are up to. Do you feel like it was profitable as like somebody dipping their toes into that domain of socialism, beyond the books, on the ground? Do you feel like it was pretty productive in that direction?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. it was I think just being there and kind of catching the fire. What was cool is being in a room full of people who were involved, if not kind of leading some of the kind of resistance fronts that I've been hearing about across the country, kind of the airport shutdowns, the response to the killings in Portland, things of that nature. People who are very invested in these communities where things are happening, in this like politically explosive time, and to have people from every corner kind of gathered under one roof felt really electric.
Yeah, I followed along on Twitter quite a bit and sort of surprised about how many people were there. Just a crazy amount of diverse left groups, I think, had some people there. So that was interesting to see.
Yeah.
I appreciated that you talked about catching the fire. Matt and I were looking at the website earlier for the conference before we were chatting, and so many of the pictures looked like Christian youth conferences, like Acquire the Fire or something.
It totally right down to like the chants before the speeches. Like,
oh my god,
yeah, it was like uncomfortably akin to a youth group, which are that kind of scene, which never really resonated with me as a youth, and so it's a little strange as a 30-year-old. Like, yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, I saw like all the pictures of people with their fists in the air and their heads down. Just actually reminded me so much of this kind of altar call experience that I've been to in youth groups. And yeah, I was just cracking up thinking about that. The socialist altar call to I don't know, repent to convert, have socialism as your true savior. I don't know. That seems very funny to me.
Well, so that actually brings up something that's really important to me, and I think it's the conspicuous lack of faith traditions there. There were definitely, visibly Islamic activists who were there. I didn't hear, I could only hear a fraction of the speeches anyway. It didn't seem to me like even among other faiths, there was a faith-based kind of impetus towards these issues. Definitely not from Christianity. And so that to me just is tragic.
Yeah.
And it's detrimental to both sides, I think. And so I feel like, I remember reading there's a Kentucky historian or archivist who's been doing research on the history of the left labor movement in Kentucky and Appalachia, throughout the early 20th century. And he's talking about the Christian Socialist newspaper, which had been, I think, run out of Chicago, but it was, being distributed down here. And I'm like, we need that. Like, that's, I want to produce that.
Socialism 2018.
Yeah, that's
exactly.
right. They should invite us to come speak there, I think.
They had all kinds of people, man. You could totally get on the docket. I don't think
that's on the agenda now.
Yeah, I actually wanted to ask you about that, sort of your experience as a person of faith there. It's interesting that there weren't a lot of visible Christians. It's funny because we've been talking to some other people involved in leftist movements over the course of this podcast, and one thing that struck me was when we talked to Derek Ford, who's a member of the PSL, the Marxist-Leninist Party. He was saying, there are people of faith in the party, but for strategic reasons, that's not really an explicit, thing that people talk about, because it's not about that for them. It's about, building that movement. And if it turns out that you have sympathies on that, then that's great. Like, you're welcome. What did you think about, that invisibility of people of faith? And as a person trying to navigate those relationships yourself, like, how do you feel as though how would you have liked to see that faith manifested in a place like that conference?
Well, I think coming from a place like ICS, where, that's where, we got to know each other. Actually, we didn't even get to know each other at ICS, but, through people in and around ICS. But
yeah, quick footnote, ICS, Institute for Christian Studies, that's where I go to school, and also where Drew went to school.
So I was introduced to a lot of leftism from an explicitly theological vantage point. You guys have talked about some of the more maybe communitarian elements, the Hauerwas Mafia, as they talk about on Homebrew Christianity. That's probably where I'd more locate myself. But leaning into more kind of explicitly, socialist movements. But I've just been exposed to so many left-wing strains of Christianity in particular, but also some other religions, that to me it just seems like, well, there's so many people that I've come across through faith that they have to be out there. They have to be involved in these other organizations. Nobody is just a member of, one. We live multifaceted lives, and so it's just weird to me that there wasn't more of a presence in a group like this. It's possible that the ISO, by its nature, like there's something self-selective about a lack of faith input. It's possible that this lineup this year just didn't happen to display that in a way that maybe other years have. Any number of things could be possible, but it just seemed tragic to me, I think, because it's in much the same way that the left talks about the working classes, who they talked about how like a third of Trump's voters were working class. So not as many as people talk about, but it was there. But they're like, those are our people, right? Like they should not be drifting right. And I think I feel the same way about faith traditions, at least, Judaism and Christianity and Islam, which I'm more familiar with than Eastern religions. But like, these should be our people, right? These should be our concerns. Why is there this kind of social gap?
Yeah, that's really interesting, huh? So it seems like it would actually be beneficial, though, to have more of a explicit sort of like faith element at these kinds of conferences.
I just think there's enough sessions that you could probably have a series of breakout sessions, or at least a panel. I think it would be interesting to have a panel.
Yeah.
With explicitly religious activists and thinkers.
Well, if for no other reason, just that, like, I don't know, working class people. I mean, people of all classes
right.
have some type of like religious desire or religious element in their life. For an emerging left in the United States, it seems essential to have to talk about that. Like finding a way to talk about that. Just leaving it like just hanging doesn't seem like a very good strategy.
Right, and I think to think in terms of demographics, I think that communities of color have never lost sight of that in their organizing. Yeah. And I think as people are rediscovering like the white working class, even though that is not by any means equivalent, and I think you can overplay that, but we are remembering that there's a segment of society that has been downtrodden and kind of crushed under capitalism in similar, if maybe not as extreme ways as other demographics. But those, elements of the working class where faith is still really important, but it's not the same level of, I guess, what we would call the social gospel has not been present or ubiquitous there in the same ways that maybe it has been in certain sectors of the Black or Latino communities.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I think, too, about how, especially in the 1960s, there are so many energizing voices that were people of faith explicitly and found ways to kind of navigate those tensions in their own lives between, I don't know, whatever their church might be saying, and then whatever their society is saying. And, really wrestling through the contradictions and the sort of welcome cooperations between those two things. It just seems as though having a giant conference of socialists would be a really useful way to kind of cross-pollinate those two things. I like that you said earlier that it would be beneficial to both sides to have that conversation.
Yeah.
I think one thing we've sort of explored already on this podcast before is how there are good critical moments where leftists ask important, troubling questions of Christians, and vice versa. There are very good critical moments where Christians have concerns and are formed to have certain concerns that might not be on the radar of particular movement builders or whatever. So yeah, it sort of seems like a no-brainer in a certain way, but of course it's definitely not. It's a big brainer, I feel like.
Galaxy brain,
yeah.
Universe brain.
Do you guys
Galaxy brain.
Do you guys find yourselves more in conversations with like non-religious leftists, trying to remind them of the space the possible space for leftist people of faith, or vice versa, trying to make leftist arguments to people of faith who wouldn't see that possibility arise?
Well, I work at a Christian university.
Okay, so let me guess.
Yeah, so it's mostly trying to convince people of faith that they should think about like leftist struggles more explicitly.
Sure.
They are oblivious to them most times.
Right.
I'm not even talking about students, because the students actually know most of the time. I'm talking about my colleagues. Yikes.
Well, the way I would answer my own question has probably changed since shifting from Christian schools, my alma mater, my undergrad and my grad at ICS, and then teaching at my alma mater, and then coming to University of Kentucky, where my friends here are almost entirely atheists, and that I'm having very different conversations than I was a few years ago.
Yeah.
Sorry, Dean, were you going to answer?
Yeah, what does that look like for you, studying social movements as a person of faith in Rand Paul's Kentucky?
So Lexington is kind of a blue oasis. I hate the blue-red colors, to indicate. Like, I always have to think which one means which, because red is not Republican, right? Like, red is leftist. So we moved here in August of 2015, got our voter registration. I say we, my wife and I. We got registered to vote almost immediately and voted in the gubernatorial election when Matt Bevin got elected that fall. And he's one in a series of these Republican governors who was just dedicated to turning their states into, Greece, basically.
Yeah.
And, imposing austerity and slashing benefits and whatnot. So Lexington has been, we had they estimated maybe 5,000 people here at the Women's March downtown. So it's a pretty small city, which is perfect for me. I really like it. But there's a significant liberal sensibility, and among those, there's a contingent or cadre of leftists. So, which of course you'll probably get at any university. But even outside of the philosophy department and the geography department and the sociology department, where there's we had this radical philosophy conference hosted at UK last fall. So there's campus leftists, but then there's also community leftists working in kind of beyond your standard Democratic Party activism or whatever. So.
Yeah, and as a person of faith navigating those spaces, do you find it sort of difficult or surprisingly not difficult to, speak that language or whatever?
Yeah, one of the first people I met here was an assistant pastor who is like a Hauerwasian anarchist, kind of a John the Baptist type, in terms of look and appearance, and his favorite thing to do.
He wears clothes made of camel hair. Is that what you're saying?
It's like 2 fashion steps away from that. But his favorite thing to do is to hang out with street folks, and so that was good. And my church is all about kind of racial justice, and so there's really I feel like we have my wife and I have found the right communities in a short amount of time within our city. I've been thinking a lot lately of and so then last year after the election I joined this more kind of radical group. But I've been thinking more recently about small town life, which is where I'm from. I'm from a small town in Iowa of 2,000 people. And as we were driving back from Chicago yesterday, we're driving through Indiana and stopped for ice cream in a town very similar to the one I grew up in. And I was thinking, kind of ruminating on a lot of the things I had learned about. I'd gone to a session about it's a group, an activist from the group called the Midwest Movement to Stop the Klan, or something, the Midwest Network to Stop the Klan.
That's good.
Who had been really active in eastern Iowa and some other states in the 90s in shutting down the Ku Klux Klan, kind of trying to make inroads. And thinking about knowing that Indiana has a history of Klan activity, and thinking about what would it look like to live in a small town and try to be a leftist, not just a liberal, but and I think one of the greatest losses of the last century has been the lack of stories and historical awareness of the inroads that socialism made in the Midwest and in Appalachia and in flyover country, basically, right? That it's not the province of kind of the bohemian urban enclaves, right? But that this is really it's been a movement of the people, like outside of the urban proletariat or whatever, right? And I think we haven't just coincidentally lost access to a lot of that. It was systematically erased from public consciousness, and I think a lot of good work it has been and is starting to be done to reclaim that.
That's really cool.
That was a
Dean.
long exchange.
Yeah, no, but Dean and I were having this conversation last night too about organizing in small towns and how difficult it is, and I don't know. I live in a super small town, and none of it's happening here, and it's really frustrating. So that people are thinking about that is very good. There's also, I think I'm like pretty sure this is true, but like the next town over from us has a active KKK sort of situation group troop, and I would love to know how to stop them from being the KKK. That'd be awesome. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah, there was a rally that was held in Eastern Kentucky recently, called by the Traditionalist Workers Party, which is like a white supremacist organization. But that to me seems like exactly the kind of thing where the way to go about shutting it down is it's not just to tell people to stop being racist, but to listen to, okay, racism has been a constant in American life, right? And this was a theme repeated a lot at the conference too, that like racism is nothing new under Trump, right? Why are these forms of racism like becoming more explicit at this moment? And they're not reducible to economic concerns, right? Like it's not as if race is this epiphenomenon just on top of an economic, infrastructural base, but the movements in those economic, tectonics, they tremble at the racial level. And I think getting people to recognize that, people like my parents, I was talking about my mom with this earlier today. She's asking about what can we do to fight racism in Northwest Iowa or whatever. And when I was talking to my wife, and our first thought was, well, maybe just recognize the existence of structural systemic racism. That as an ideological shift, that is such a it's a big hurdle to clear.
Yeah, it seems like Christianity should have like a huge play in this, though. Like, it's my assumption, and I don't think it's a wrong assumption, though, that like people in smaller towns and rural spaces are more religious. I don't know if more religious is the right word, but like there's more of a latent Christianity that's like sort of still stuck around. But yeah, it seems like our Christianity should make us really allergic to these things, to racism, and like especially structural racism. But it feels like we just miss it so often because of like sort of like the way that Christianity has been co-opted by, I don't know, white supremacy, the bourgeoisie, etc.
Yeah, and I feel that way particularly as someone coming out of a Calvinist tradition, and like I'm loosely a Methodist now, going to a UNC church, but for Calvinists, there's such a sense of like ontological guilt that precedes you, and I think a lot of progressive Christians are really allergic to that for some good reasons, because that's a way to keep people down and then exploit them spiritually, maybe. But I think it's also a really good way to help people think about the way that we are complicit in systemic evil, in ways that, okay, I never owned slaves, but that doesn't mean that somehow I haven't benefited from a slave-owning culture, right? Or slave-owning ancestors, if I have them. I'm not aware that I do, but, that doesn't get me off the hook for the kind of society that I live in. So, I think you're right, Matt, that Christians should be like more open to this way of thinking than anyone. But for whatever series of reasons, we retreat to this individualism, and I think a lot of it has to do with this supernatural divide. The sense that like ultimately your commitment is from you to God, right? And if it happens to affect other people, then that's just a bonus. But mostly it's about your intentions. It's about your personal, and I don't know. There's so many theological currents that would resist that way of thinking if we really like spill out the implications of theology.
Yeah, it's funny. I wonder if there's a way in which this is just a very textbook example of where the left can help Christianity solve some of its own internal problems, because there's this intuitive sense that I think is right, that we're talking about that Christians should be allergic to these things, but for whatever reason they're not. Well, one reason that leftists don't like Christians is that we built all those things. Like, it was Christians who made slavery. It was Christians who made capitalism. There's no getting around that situation. And there are all kinds of ways of dealing with that problem, but, it's even Pope Francis sort of recently, in the last couple of years, has been talking this language of, Christians are the ones responsible for these things that seem so non-Christian, as opposed to creating a kind of no true Scotsman faith or whatever.
Yeah.
I wonder if there's a way that the left can help Christianity purge some of its own demons in that way, or at least come to terms with its legacy, and then conversely, Christians can hopefully listen to those things and find resources in their own vocabularies that work against those tendencies or something. That would be my hope, anyway.
It makes me think back to the conversation we had a few weeks ago about Herbert McCabe. Again, when he says, Christianity isn't, it doesn't have like a theory, right? And that like the sort of like leftist modes of thought and critique are the addition that Christianity needs to like be better than it has been.
So on that note, were there any sessions that you found, Drew, particularly interesting and helpful, like ones that just really stuck out and stick with you, and things that you're still thinking about? Like we said earlier, Matt and I didn't go. We were sort of perusing the schedule and the talks before we started talking. And some of the titles looked intriguing, interesting, and cool, but I'm a master of making really cool titles with substanceless prose, so maybe you could help us cut behind the advertising and tell us which one stuck out to you.
Yeah, so there were a few people that I really wanted to see whose talks weren't necessarily super enlightening, but were just inspiring. So people like Amy Goodman from Democracy Now! And Bhaskar Sankara from Jacobin, and Ajamu Baraka from he was ran as the Green Party running mate this past election season, and he's a board member of Cooperation Jackson, which I didn't know. Are you guys familiar with that?
No,
I'm not.
It's a really exciting movement of Black radical organizers in Jackson, Mississippi, who had run they ran a candidate for mayor several years ago and got someone to fight privatization and austerity measures, and he had a heart attack within a year, and they lost the seat to a Republican, I believe. But They just got his son elected in the mayorship this past year.
That's awesome.
But like an explicitly socialist group of organizers who have been trying to put together, general assemblies of community members and stuff. So anyway, that's inspiring. Several inspiring speakers, and then a few really enlightening speakers that I was also excited to see. So Keeanga Yamato Taylor was there, the author of From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. And she talked about racism as, a constant feature of American society, but exploring, okay, why is this particular feature of racism, and also the anti-racism movements like Black Lives Matter is what she'd focused on. Elsewhere in the conference, they were talking about Standing Rock. Amy Goodman spent a lot of time talking about Standing Rock, but kind of rendering these movements as anti-fascist, as anti-racist. But a lot of these presenters were talking about, fascism as kind of a loosely connected series of cultural activities or tendencies, having less to do with authoritarianism, the way the word typically gets trotted out, but using it more in the sense of a false revolution, or like a pseudo socialism, right? And I think that's the right way to think about it, is that whatever we could call fascist, and I think the whole Trump phenomenon, I would call it proto-fascist, as a number of people at the conference would probably, but it's explicitly a false revolution, right? That it's making promises it couldn't keep, and even if it kept them, it's only for a select group, right? Now, within that group, it is an anti-capitalist, at least rhetoric, right? So that's in the air, and that's why it's dangerous, right? Because like where we go from here, like something's got to give. So anyway, if fascism is primarily a scapegoating mechanism, shifting class conscious resistance of the castification of society into racialized exclusion and blame, right? That's racism is the primary way, Kianga was saying, in that the ruling classes have divided the working class, and so that's not a new insight, but to hear it kind of portrayed with a number of different examples in current events was, I think, helped me to think about ways to connect all these struggles together. Because I think the tendency, I think a lot about, have you guys ever read Terry Eagleton's essay on postmodernism? Yeah, where he talks about basically intellectual culture, the leftist intellectual culture, and probably activism too. He doesn't get into that as much. But since the 60s, kind of what we call the new left, right, is basically a failed revolution. It's a response to the failure of radicalism, of whether that's socialism or anarchism or communism or whatever. And it's become kind of this self devouring or cannibalizing, fracturing dynamic where we make it impossible to generate unified social movements just because, identity politics, which not to like jump on that as like all bad or something, but there's definitely troublesome aspects of the emphasis to identify yourself against other members of the radical class, right? And so I think that was what was really encouraging to me about this conference. And actually, that's something that really drew me to the Kianga Taylor in the first place. Was after the Women's March, there were a number of criticisms of it as being really liberal and bourgeois and all these privileged women, white women, and their, male friends and counterparts, whatever, coming out because finally these policies affect them in a way that they have affected, women of color all along. Or trans women or whoever. And they're like, oh, now you get with the program. And Kianga's like, yeah, now you get with the program. That's great. Like, why are we taking this moment to like put people down when we should be celebrating? Like, and so I think that affirmative moment is what, I mean, that's the reformational side of me. The dean, that's the whole philosophical tradition at ICS is trying to, it's kind of an Augustinian sense of like finding that originary goodness, right, and affirming it, and theorizing evil or whatever as some privation of that in some way.
That's some cool insight, I guess. It reminds me of this thing that Marx said once, and I'm trying desperately to remember where, but I gotta remember. Somewhere though, Marx said that like the bourgeoisie are the real revolutionary class insofar as they keep creating technologies to stay in power, sort of against the proletariat who don't, or who have not historically done so. But I think that's a good example of the ways that like, I don't know, the fracturing of identity politics works against the left a lot of times.
Yeah. Well, I wonder if we could maybe start talking a little bit about more generally socialism 2017, or what it means to talk about socialist movements this year, sort of beyond the conference and in general. And this is a good place to start, I think, because one thing that I've found kind of troubling about how socialism is emerging after Donald Trump and with the kind of rise of certain publications that have become more popular over time, i.e. Jacobin Magazine, there's a sense in which the call to unify under the banner of class is often made to the exclusion of other kinds of oppression that I find really troubling and damaging. And I don't know, to take a sort of common example, like Jacobin is constantly getting in trouble for basically saying that, racism is bad and, we should talk about it, but what really matters is not getting distracted from the real root of all the oppression, which is class, right? And I don't know, I find that like completely bad and very toxic to unifying like a real movement that could take account of the various ways in which our world is kind of riven by different forms of systemic oppression that are nonetheless, related in intricate kind of networked ways. It's almost too simple of a story to kind of say that, well, if we unify the working class, then racism would go away because we would all have a common enemy. And, it just feels so awkward to me. And I wonder, did you hear that kind of rhetoric there? How do you feel about that kind of rhetoric? Maybe you don't care. I don't know. But it's a problem that I have, I guess.
No, I mean, I think that is certainly, it's a tendency that I'm always checking in myself. I think because, I mean, at a psychological level, I mean, I am a member of the working class, like the privileged working class, right? So like, if you look at my paycheck, you look at how my family is like scrambling to make ends meet or whatever, like that those are working class phenomena. On the other hand, I'm in a PhD program. Like theoretically, I'm on the track to a middle class job, which may or may not exist. But so I, at the egotistical level, like I would want to identify as a member of a struggling class. I can't do that in terms of race or in terms of other things. So I think that's a tendency to check, right, in someone like myself, because I want to be able to say, life is hard for me and there's somebody making it hard. But I know that's not true in a lot of ways, right? I know that I have so many privileges and belong to more powerful sectors of society and benefit from them. So I think you're absolutely right, Dean. And thankfully, most of the people at the conference, I think, recognize that too. So someone else who addressed this was Sarah Jaffe, a radical journalist. And I think she, and also Kianga and a number of others, they tread that line really well, like without ever abandoning this sense that like, no, like women's struggles and the struggles of the Latina community and the Black community and LGBT struggles, like obviously these things are all connected. And so there was a session that Kianga was a part of on the Combahee River Collective, which is about kind of one of the original intersectional analysis moments, right, in among Black feminists, Black lesbian feminists. I didn't get a chance to go to that, unfortunately, but I'm really interested now in kind of the history of that. But one of the things that Sarah Jaffe said was, well, first of all, like the working class has never been white, right? The working class has never been primarily white. It's never been primarily male. So we've got to break out of that image, right? The image of Joe the plumber or of the carrier plant workers or whoever Trump kind of put as the standard working man. I do think that like to say that racism has been a constant in America, it's an insufficient explanation for acts of racism and these kind of spikes in racist activity and rhetoric. And I think most of those can be explained by economic circumstances, which doesn't at all eliminate the racism. I think it's a confluence or a conjunction of those kind of oppressive vectors. To me, that doesn't take away from the kind of greater suffering of communities of color or of women or of LGBT people. To me, that is the site of conjoint oppression, and so that should be the site of resistance. And I don't know that, Dean, I'm guessing you'd want to push back on that, although I'm not entirely sure why.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm suspicious of the oppression model because I don't think that societies are built on singular causes and effects, no matter how massive they might spin themselves out, and with as many complicated tendrils might extend from, say, economic oppression. I guess there's a part of me that wants to say, well, after the revolution, when all the economic oppression is gone and we live in a classless society, will people still be homophobic? Probably. Will they still be racist? Probably. And is that necessarily an effect of their previous class identities? I would say maybe not. There are ways in which racism motivated, for example, like you couldn't have had the North Atlantic slave trade without racism. Despite the fact that that's obviously motivated by capitalism, obviously racism was instrumental in reinforcing those capitalist narratives and stopping people from uniting. That's all true, but I think there's a lot of important work in critical race theory that shows there's kind of just more happening, and it seems to me as though the story is just frustratingly complex, and you kind of have to fight on every front at the same time, and find some other principle of sufficient unity beyond like helping everyone to come to grips with just their class identity, for example, or trying to convert the class oppressor within or something alone, you know. So I don't know. I mean, I guess I just think, how would I put this? I guess you could say this is my original sin moment paired with your original love moment or original goodness moment. You know, that like in a way every single thing is bad. Even though there might be hopefully something good underneath it that we could tap into.
No, I think that's really important. I think I would affirm almost everything you said.
Yeah.
I think of capitalism as exacerbating all those tendencies and co-op.
Yeah.
And so to talk about like the revolution, which I'm always like skeptical of anyway, like I think it's more about, you know, building the new in the shell of the old. That it's a triage procedure, right? It's trying to find the tactically most helping the most in the least amount of time or something. Like psychoanalysis like has the goal not necessarily of restoring people to full flourishing, but just helping. What's the phrase that Freud uses? To turn the like neurotic suffering into ordinary unhappiness or something like that.
Yeah.
Think, like to give us some breathing space or some margin to be able to effectively tackle the like. I don't know. To me, it seems like first of all, economic issues are more acutely like suffered by all of the groups that you mentioned. That in no way detract, like to fight on that front in no way detracts from their struggles. I don't know. I think we always have to fight that our own tendencies towards patriarchy and white supremacy and stuff. And you can see that in certain kind of class-based analyses. There's always that temptation, but I don't think that means that strategy is wrong. I think it means you proceed with the knowledge that we are always going to be tempted to put, you know, straight white males in charge and the interests of straight white males in charge. Like, I don't know. That's where I would land on that issue.
Yeah, for sure. Matt, what do you think? Do you have any particular like gripes with socialism today, or hopes, I guess, in terms of how, I don't know, all these disparate threads might get unified, or stopping them from getting further and further divided from each other? Yeah,
this is okay. So you guys were having a great back and forth about this issue of like class and race, and I think that's absolutely important to have that conversation. That's good. Though I think there's another type of identity politics going on with socialism today. This is based on my own experience of being a person on Twitter, and basically that's it. So maybe these aren't all the best takes.
It's good field work, actually.
Yeah, I guess so. Maybe like last week, it was before the conference started. There's this like kind of eruption of interesting identity politics of a different kind in leftist Twitter, at least. And this is like maybe my the thing that caused me the most anxiety about socialism in 2017. And Drew, maybe you saw this at the conference. Maybe you didn't. I hope you didn't. Anyways, so this article got published by Socialist Alternative. I don't really know much about them as a group. I know that they're like a Trotskyist organization, and I don't know. They seem nice enough, I guess. Anyways, they published this article that was basically, I'm sure like everyone on Twitter saw it, but it was just like, hey, the DSA is really popular right now, and they have lots of momentum. Maybe the DSA should start a new political like front, a new political party. That was like the suggestion from the Socialist Alternative. Anyways, the DSA on Twitter, at least, and on the DSA dank meme stash on Facebook, which is the worst the worst thing I've ever seen in my entire life. They all like hated this article and said, "Hey, no, that's a bad idea. Socialist Alternative just wants our members. They're just jealous that we're bigger than them." Like lots of like stupid commentary. And anyways, I think that socialism in 2017, you can't really talk about it without the complete stupidity of people getting upset that their socialist group is better than the other socialist group, or like those divisions of like whose fringe leftist group is better. So, Drew, did you see any of that at Socialism 2017?
I didn't actually see that much of that, thankfully, but the awareness of that was in the air. And it made me think, once again, of this is why religious people are needed. Because if anybody knows how to deal with factionalism and sectarianism and is aware of the dangers that come with like the infinite fractals of petty divisions, like it's religious people, right? That's not to say, and so to get back to a major theme of the conference, which is unity out of division. Recognize everyone was like upfront about the dangers of that, of papering over real differences and real injustices, where the people who tend to get hurt the most tend to get their voices tend to get suppressed, even within the resistance movements, right? Like that, everyone was talking about that, and so there was a lot of talk about a united front, and so this was talking about. Bridging the divide, not necessarily between any of these demographics that we've been discussing, but between radicals and liberals, or centrists, I guess. People more amenable to kind of bourgeois society, and I'm probably nearer that than a lot of my compatriots or comrades, right? Like, but it's all about the united front of these tactical alliances. And they contrasted that with a popular front, and Trotsky writes about this, which is giving up giving the reins to the same kinds of. I guess today we might talk about it in terms of nonprofits as funded by ultimately the same capitalist class that you're fighting, right? It's the bone that they throw to the people working like dogs, right? So the difference. And I was really unclear about the difference because people kept using this terminology. Like, we need a united front between all these, because we in the left have a tendency towards factionalism, right? We keep shooting ourselves in the foot by infinite divisions, but then saying, okay, we also can't we can't compromise. Like, these principles matter, and so one of the key compromises that they address is like giving the keys to the kingdom to the Democrats again and again. Who then, of course, led in the barbarians, right? Like everybody in. And so I was like, well, what's the difference between these two? Like the United Front on the one hand, the Popular Front on the other. And somebody said, and in retrospect, it's pretty obvious like what the difference is. But it's who is doing the organizing, right? Is it that we are lending our voices to the same kinds of well, uncharitably, it would be like a milquetoast kind of grant-sponsored activism, right? Or are we taking it into our own hands? And if those people want to come on board, we want to have them. But like, we put the radical agenda first and foremost, and whoever can unite in that, right? Come on board, or link. Maybe not come on board, but like link arms or something. So thinking about that. Theme in relation to some of the things that Dean is discussing, I was in no. I had actually thought about your concern, Dean, for the loss of all of these other fronts that we need to be fighting on, right, in the interest of economic justice. And just looking at the composition of this conference, like it was. I don't even want to hazard a guess as to like gender proportions. It was at least half and half, male, well, with some gender nonconforming folks as well. But in terms of like ethnic and racial identities, there seemed to be a lot of people of color represented, not only in the audience but also among the moderators and the presenters and the keynotes as well. I don't think there was any. Yeah, there was no way that that problem was going to rear itself at this particular conference. Now, that doesn't apply to the rest of socialism dumb, I suppose.
Yeah, for sure. I guess maybe that would be one good transferable skill between Christianity and socialism, is a kind of ecumenical sensibility that's capable of, I don't know, both respecting people's doctrinal hangups and also trying to find ways in which we can all, sit at the same table or something, especially when it comes to issues of justice. It's like, there are a lot of reasons I don't like Jacobin magazine, but I do read the articles in it because I think class is important. Class oppression is important. It's in the same way that, it's important to me to read people who are writing on Black liberation, but who nonetheless might be liberals, because there's something wrong about an inability to understand the way in which all those kinds of things overlap and reinforce each other and build the other one, in these kind of complicated relationships. But those kinds of gaps, I guess, don't preclude the importance of those conversations. And I think that that conference, from what you're saying, seems to be a material manifestation of exactly that, hopefully, anyway.
Yeah. Are there other tendencies that concern you? Like you said, you don't really like reading Jacobin. Like what else is in the water that you find to be a bit poisonous?
Yeah, I don't know. I think the biggest thing for me, I don't know if anybody else shares this, but I assume they probably do, is just the magnitude of the problems, right? We had this conversation with Lambert Zeidevart a while back in ICS Prof, and the big takeaway quote from that was, revolution isn't what it used to be, by which Lambert basically meant society is very complicated, more complicated even now than it was, 100 years ago when the Bolsheviks won a revolution against a czar. And I think there's a sense for me that these kinds of intricate, complicated, technological, financial situations that we find ourselves in are very hard to find, like a one handle that everybody could grab onto by which you could kind of pull it down or something. Matt and I were talking earlier about how, like, one of the perennial frustrations of being involved in the left is that you can see all these organizations and conferences and everything else, but no one's actually really doing anything significant enough to be, I don't know, a real challenge to the powers that be. Like, one of the big ironies of the Socialism 2017 conference is it was held at, like, the Hyatt Hotel, which is fine. Like, people have to hold things in places that can sustain X amount of people. But it's like, if you had a massive gathering of socialists in a hotel and the hotel didn't get, like, burned down, or, like, there wasn't a massive, like, organized strike there the next day or something, then it's kind of like, why even have it? Which isn't to say that it was useless. I don't know. I wasn't there or anything. But I guess that's the poison in the water, as you would say, is that these ideas are very good and very inspiring and hopeful and encouraging, but the material ramifications don't seem to sustain the kind of inspiration that you can get from, the romance of socialism or something like that.
Yeah, and that insight about the hotel did not go unobserved at the conference. Ahmed Shaki talked about that in the plenary on Saturday night. Well, first of all, he called it a supposedly 4-star hotel. But then talking about how incomprehensible that would be the world over, right? And he's like, but think about where else we could hold it, right? Universities is like, and he went on this kind of Lewis Black-like rant about it, about the, you got to pay for everything. And apparently this was the most feasible or whatever. But no, I'm allergic to those kind of things. It feels so wrong. I mean, I took the L up to the north side each night to stay at a friend's place. But plenty of people were staying in the hotel or whatever. It seems very, counterproductive.
Yeah, it's like, why not have it at, like, a public park or, like, a library or, a vaguely socialist institution that already exists in a capitalist society?
Yeah, exactly. And so what I'm thankful for is, so just to put in a plug for this local group, the Kentucky Workers League, where I've learned a lot of things about activism, because the things that I've known about the left have largely been Western Marxist intellectuals, right? And so, like, actually learning about activism has been kind of informed through the people I've known here in Lexington. And their whole strategy is dual power, which is basically the Black Panthers approach. It's the approach of people in like Cooperation Jackson, and it's it's trying to provide actual services and build actual institutions under the nose of privatization, right? And like privatized service and goods production, and using that as a way to build a base of, and just, I mean, it's how certain anarchists talk about the prefigurative kind of vision for collective action, right? Like that. Well, let's just start living the way that we want to see the world, and that gets crushed in a lot of ways, and it's not always possible. But I think that, in conjunction with tendencies like worker cooperatives and there's a whole bunch of exciting things happening right now, and I want to be a part of all of them and bring them all to my backyard. Like literally, like there's we've got a nice park in our backyard, and there's the community group that meets there that I've been involved with, and I want to radicalize it as much as possible. There's a guy there that I want to learn from, who's talking about being a member of like an affiliate group of the Black Panthers back in the 60s, and like I'm like, man, there's so much to learn. Like, and I think that was the thing to take away from the conference too, is that activists have a tendency to reinvent the wheel, and it's partly out of necessity because our leaders keep getting jailed and shot. Like, to be able to reclaim a lot of history that is not just, white male-led leftists, but these kind of, I was going to say minority reports, but that, that's a little on the nose. People have been doing this the world over out of sheer necessity in response to, I'm going to say capitalism, but Dean, you're right to say like these forces of oppression that have long predated anything related to privatization, right? And I think we have to learn from that. And I certainly have a lot to learn from that.
I think one of my frustrations with this, though, so I mean, like, I don't know, it's funny that it's in the Hyatt, like, but I get it. It's important. They need a place to do it. But like, you're right. People are doing this the world over, and they're doing it like much better than in the United States. People actually have parties other places, and like, are doing something very positive, and not just like in Western countries either. Like, Dean and I are like obsessed with the Philippines, and like that's always the place I'm looking to. They have parties, they have fronts, they just know what they're doing. They have their act together, and it seems like there's so much. There's momentum and there's energy, and people are like, I think, ready to do stuff, but for some reason it just doesn't ever really materialize into these like forms of like actual political engagement in the United States. I remember one time I was at this Marxism conference in Massachusetts, and Jody Dean was speaking there, and she's very cool. And Jody Dean gave this like kind of infamous talk at this point where she's just like, we need a new communist party. And at the end of the talk, everyone was like, yeah, sounds good, sign me up. Like literally, there were old white professors that were like saying that. I mean, of course they were. But then like no one did it. Like no one signed them up. Like, and like that's kind of, I guess, a move that I keep seeing happen whenever I'm around like leftists, and I don't actually, I mean, I live in a small town, so I don't find myself around leftists very often. But they're like, yeah, we should do something. Yeah, a party would be great. Yeah, a platform for this would be good. But I just like don't see it happening. I don't know why like these steps though don't materialize in like the party structure or something like that. I mean, like the DSA is great, the social alternative is great, PSL great, but like why do they stay so disparate, do you think?
If I had to hazard a guess, I think it's because our model of activism has largely. So, have you guys read Jane McAlevey at all? Or McAlevey? I'm not sure how to say her name.
I haven't.
Okay, so she's been a labor organizer for several decades with I think she's worked for several federations, but kind of on the CIO model, kind of the old world labor organizing model, which is explicitly class conscious, like assuming class warfare, like there's no anti-collaborationist. And she was involved with like the Chicago Teachers Union strike, and she's been organizing nurses in hospitals and stuff. But she says that healthcare and education and one other sector are probably the kind of economic demographics to look at for actual labor organizing. Anyway, she wrote a book called No Shortcuts that came out last year, and she breaks down activism into like 4 different categories, and she talks about how if you can think about like concentric rings in terms of their proximity to capital, we have like charities, right, which are largely funded as nonprofits, ultimately driving their money either from the government, which of course takes their marching orders a lot of times from the needs of the wealthy and companies, or from grants from the foundations run by the same people. And then there's activists who kind of speak on behalf of these groups, of groups of the oppressed, right? And kind of dedicate their time towards speaking out as representatives of them in their interests. And then she talks about mobilizers, which are these popular actions, right? But like oftentimes momentary, not necessarily strategic, but you get a lot of people out like for the Science March, or a lot of people out for the Women's March or whatever. And it's kind of the thing that you were saying with Jody Dean, right? Who incidentally, she came to speak at Lexington last year. And I remember coming away thinking, man, here's another person who needs to be talking with a religious figure, because everything she said sounds like it sounded really fundamentalist, first of all. But just deeply religious. Anyway, that's beside the point. So mobilization as an important moment in organizing, but she says what we call organizing tends to refer to all those activities, but it should really be reserved for the hard work of relationship building among, well, primarily peer-to-peer. And she said the old CIO model, the kinds of, when communists and socialists were organizing people in the 20s and 30s, and it was spreading like wildfire across America, and even earlier, kind of with the IWW and Eugene V. Debs and whatever, that like organizing has to be face to face. It has to be primarily relational, and you map out your you map out the power structure and understand the pressure points of kind of what you're up against. But you map the assets that you have, and you're extremely aware of the people in your proximity and these networks of like social relations, right? And to get away from that vanguardist mindset, which has kind of driven the labor movement, if you can call it a movement, since the 70s, if not earlier, right? Which is just top down. And so it's like what socialism should be, which is just bottom up, right? Grassroots, to use the buzzword. But like actual organizing, as opposed and following through and expecting people to participate and funding it through dues, right? Not relying on external funding, but like a self-generating movement. I think that was kind of an answer to a question you had, Matt, but I don't.
It is totally, and I think the face-to-face organizing is awesome, and like that, I 100% agree that is a thing you need to do. I guess the difficulty is though that, okay, this is maybe a weird insight, but like the face-to-face organizing and sort of like building that you do on the ground with people has to be connected to like a larger goal or organization or set of practices or ideology, or else it just sort of falls flat at this very basic level before it ever gets momentum enough to register like on a national level. So I'm like all for those things, but I feel like it just needs to connect to like a larger sort of organ or a piece. This is continuing my critique of the DSA, of which I paid dues to. I don't know, for better or worse. That like there are all these little like chapters every single place, and that's awesome, and they all have these different sort of like local organizing tactics that they do, and that's also good. But there's like no like fundamental ideology of the DSA, except that like I don't know, democratic socialism is good, and like single payer healthcare is a thing that people want, which are again like great goals, but there's just not like it's not an organization that has a vision for the future. And I think that's some of like, I guess what I don't like is that organizing is good, but we have to have an idea of like trajectory or direction that the organizing is going. And that's what I see missing in a lot of places.
Let me just wrap up kind of in response to what you're saying.
Yeah, please.
So I'm sitting here with my kids. Something I've been thinking about a lot is childcare. So we talked about childcare at the conference. I think to address what you were talking about, Dean, with not letting economic concerns get in the way of other social justice fights, right? I think rethinking childcare is a huge one just because of the lingering sexism built into our economy. Even, like, my wife and I have tried to make all kinds of different arrangements work to take care of our kids simultaneously with me being in school and working. And we can't, like, you just can't. Like, there's no good way to do it. And so I've been thinking a lot about, like, what would a dual power daycare look like?
Oh
like,
my God, yes.
What would a community-driven model for, like, thinking up and down our street, there are so many single parents at home with their kids right now, right? It's just stupid. Like, we're all sitting in our different places. Like, we could be pooling our resources. That's the kind of future I want, right? And what the right will say in response to something like that is, oh, you want the state to raise your kids. I'm like, sure, if we are the state, that's totally fine with me. Like,
yeah, man, that's good though. I mean, because domestic labor is real labor, and I think that people forget that a lot of times. Talking about ways to communize daycare is awesome. And sorry,
and it's one of the things that I want to study in my dissertation. Actually, is a lot kind of feminist economics and thinking through care work, and partly because I'm so bad at offering my wife a real like putting it, like, practicing what I preach, essentially.
So listeners, you can't really see us right now, but Drew has 2 babies on him, and they are like pulling his headphones off, and it is the cutest thing I've ever seen in my entire life.
Yeah, huge fan.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to wrap up, guys. Sorry.
No, it's cool. You do you, man. That's great. Thanks for talking with us, though. We appreciate it.
Listen, I need to put this back on.
This is the best.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's really cool.
All right. Well, good luck commonizing your daycare situation soon, Drew. And it was so great to talk to you. Hopefully, we'll see you in a socialist church one day in the future.
Sounds good. Peace, brothers.
Later.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. Thanks for Drew being on the show. Thank you to Drew's cute children who also gave us a good way to stop talking and dragging that conversation out. That was the best thing. High point of my day for sure. Cool. So please leave us a review on iTunes so we can lightly mock you and then also talk our podcast up. It definitely helps, I guess, the algorithms. Tell your friends. Follow us on Twitter. We have so many Twitter followers right now. Last week we just blew up. It's nuts. 50 followers in like a week. That was a monumental occasion. Yeah, that Lit Crit guy bump. That's good. Good stuff. All right, so follow us on all the social medias and join the reading group if you haven't. Okay, see you next week.
Bye-bye.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late.